Did you guys know I have a face? So, face, apparently. I just got done watching Star Trek, and sadly I had to clean my nails. Tried to paint them, didn't work out so well. But while I was thinking, I decided to make a video about a topic that I don't think gets enough recognition. And that's mostly on religious beliefs on Australian Aboriginals. People that generally don't get that much attention either way, apparently. Specifically, I would like to talk about reincarnation. Reincarnation seems to be widespread across the world. You also have the common belief in India where you would be reincarnated into an animal of sorts, whether that be a cricket, cow, and whatnot. But also probably the most famous example would be Jesus himself being reincarnated, coming back from the dead after, dying, crucifixed, and whatnot, after 3 days. But anyways, yes, reincarnation widespread across the world. But it's not really talked about in the concept of Australians, specifically. And I would like to touch on that for just a bit. I'm a compassionate traveler, by the way, if you can't read, I guess. So several explorers in Australia, mostly European explorers, when they would travel around across Australia and talk to indigenous people, they would also learn their customs and beliefs, one of them being specifically about reincarnation. Now, there are several examples of this, but I want to specifically talk about one, and that is for the Aranda people, who have this belief that you are reincarnated from a totemic ancestor of sorts. And that totemic ancestor could generally be, let's call them like the originals, specifically. Like they were the first ones in the mythology and the Dreamtime of sorts. And then once you were born, you would inhabit the soul of that totemic ancestor as if you were one-to-one. Once you die, the totemic ancestor spirit comes back and re-enters as soon as that said child is born. But that's not the only reincarnation belief. Not only can it change of sorts, but it can also happen when they come in contact with certain people. There were some Australian Aboriginals that believe when Europeans came, they were in fact reincarnated spirits of Aboriginals, which I find very surprising and very interesting for a group of people to deem another group of people just dead, just walking corpses, zombies. Not exactly zombies, but basically zombies. What really intrigued me with this topic of sorts was this book called The Other Side of the Frontier. That's upside down. Other Side of the Frontier by Henry Reynolds. And he talks, it's mostly, he talks about Australian Aboriginals when they were in contact with Europeans. He talks about settlement of Australians and how that affected Australian Aboriginals. He talks about how the beliefs of Australian Aboriginals when it comes to their equipment, but also when it comes to themselves. One example of that would have to be on page 41, I believe, in chapter 2. There is an account by George Gray, an explorer of sort, who is down in southern Australia. And I'll read it for you now. A sort of procession came up, headed by two women, down whose cheeks tears were streaming. The eldest of these came up to me and looked for a moment. I said, "Yes, yes, in truth it is him." And then throwing her arms around me, cried bitterly, her head resting upon my breast. And although I was totally ignorant of what their meaning was, from where motives of compassion, I offered no resistance to her careness. At last, the old lady, emboldened by my submission, deliberately kissed me on each cheek. She then cried a little more, and at length, relieving me, assured me that I was the ghost of her son, who had some time before been killed by a spear wound in his breast. My new mother expressed almost as much delight at my return to my family as my real mother would have done, had I been unexpectedly restored to her. That, my friends, is very interesting. I at least find it interesting, at least, and I hope you do too, with this video at least. But it's clear that these people had a deep-rooted attachment to this belief. They obviously believed it. I mean, unless you were a pristine actor, of course, I don't think you can force yourself to cry at the sight of someone that you don't really know, but you think you know that it's your son. Now, there's one thing that I do indeed want to bring up with this discussion, and it's logic discussion and how we come to conclusions of sorts. I think, because they were not introduced to scientific methods and sorts, it would make sense for these two possibilities. I mean, if you look at the Junga, a term used by the Nugara, they considered white people as simply walking corpses. And it kind of makes sense. In southwestern Australia, when settlers would come up to the shore, make up settlements, Aboriginals, like the Nugara, noticed that they're dormants and figured those look sort of similar to what we use when we bury them of sorts. Now, I don't know exactly what they could be referring to, but that's just the quotes that some people have gathered up. And think about it for a second. Like in the Americas, Europeans Europeans, just like in the Americas, Europeans brought disease with them that the indigenous inhabitants were not related to. Where else do you get diseases from when it's in a body? Corpses. Get too close to his corpse, you can get infected, you could die. If you get too close to a European, you are not immune to those diseases. You will die eventually of those sorts. So to them, it just simply makes sense. Now, of course, in later years, when scientific methods would come to the shores of Australia, it's pretty much determined that white people are not indeed corpses. At least, I'm not. But in Australia, it is pretty much the consensus that white people do indeed come from Europe, because it's a fucking cold up there, as you can imagine. I also want to discuss a few problems that I have with other side of the frontier. It uses too much of the term Aboriginal of sorts as just an all-encompassing term. But I have a secret for you. You know the reincarnation belief that I first brought up about having a totemic ancestor? Well, that's not the only one. That comes from the Aranda people, the central Aranda people, which is different from the northern Aranda people. The northern Aranda people believed in a two-spirit system of sorts. Sorry if I butchered these names, by the way. Sadly, I have not taken pronunciation classes in Central Aboriginal Australian language. But they had a two-spirit system. Arumburinga, they had a two-spirit system. Arumburinga, which is basically that totemic ancestor of sorts. But there is also the Kurana. The Kurana being the new spirit, bring the new spirit, your own spirit that is specific to you. And they believe that the Orenbringa would give you your personality, your looks, as if it was like that totemic ancestor. But your parents would give you your Kurana, which is your own self, your own mortality of sorts. And then once you were killed by spear, bullet, whatnot, your Kurana would travel up to a shack of sorts and be destroyed by lightning, while the Orenbringa would simply lay dormant until obviously a baby would pop out, Orenbringa just pop back in. But those aren't the only forms of reincarnation, not only in actual religious belief, but also in just stories in general. One example of the changes of stories of sorts comes from a sort of collections of stories by King Langloh Parker. Wise Woman of the Dreamtime. And in several stories, there are accounts of people coming back to life of sorts. Like in a story where a witch, she comes, terrorizes the town until she gets pelted with spears. She dies, but she's reincarnated into an echidna of sorts. Another thing in, say, Queensland, they believe that your ancestral body would go up into the heavens, the stars, and be amongst in the sky itself. Another belief in a certain reincarnation, like in the Aranda people, is that when a figure is killed, they don't truly die. It's simply that their body just takes a new form of sorts, whether in like a new man. But it shows that the soul is immortal and can be transported into different places. But not only is the idea of reincarnations different, but also in the other side of the frontier, it does explain that later on, it was believed, the consensus in the Aboriginals is that it was believed that white people came from far distant, let's say, eastern islands of sorts. And I think the problem with, these two books that I've shown, but also in Australian academia of sorts, is that it kind of generalizes a lot. It doesn't give tribes or clans their own distinct beliefs of sorts. I mean, I think when most people think of Australian Aboriginals, they just think of just bare naked hunter-gatherers with like a kangaroo pelt or something around their waist. But we don't get to see the diversity of sorts. We only get to see sort of just huts. We don't think about the stone structures that the Aborigines, but we don't think about the different beliefs. We don't think of like how some believe that the spirit would go off into the woods and have a possibility to be corrupted. We don't think about how the spirit will also lay dormant and also probably duplicate of sorts. You go into several siblings and whatnot. And we don't have separate mythologies. We just think of it all as one mythology. And I can imagine that some Aboriginal tribes don't have these stories, or at least didn't gain them until pagan indigeneity in Australia came to be. And I think academics really need to work on differentiating of sorts. There were indeed hunter-gatherers, but Bruce Pascoe and several books before him have brought up the idea of sort of settled or semi-settled communities of sorts who probably have their own different religious beliefs because they're growing crops, they're staying in one place for long periods of time, so probably they may or may not have house spirits, they may or may not have vegetable spirits. We don't truly know, and I think that's disappointing of sorts, that we can only stick to generalizations and not people's own distinct culture. If you like this video, please consider watching more of it. It's not even subscribing, not even liking. I just want you to watch more because I love to teach. I want to teach more about colonialism and what happened beforehand, what happened afterwards, and just general things that I myself am interested in. I'm Compassionate Traveler. Thank you for watching.